Hello and welcome. I'm Ray Baker. I'm here with DC Black Power Chronicles. My guest today, Kojo Nnamdi. Kojo Nnamdi is a world-renowned journalist who's made his bones right here in Washington, D.C., but has a rich history and legacy that we're excited to dive into. We're going to talk and start our conversation with our guest, Kojo Nnamdi. Kojo, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're well known here in Washington, D.C., but you're impactful all over the world in your life, but people know Kojo Nnamdi. How does Rex, Orville, Montague Paul become Kojo Nnamdi?
Well, clearly my parents got carried away with the Christian names. Rex, Orville, Montague was a lot of Christian names to have. But I carried that with me until, I guess it was 1970. I came to Washington in 1969 and became a part of an organization called the Center for Black Education, an organization which had been founded out of a program at what was then Federal City College, now part of the University of the District of Columbia, at what was then Federal City College, that had a focus on black education, and the founders of that program decided that black education at that time would perform more effectively if it was based in the community rather than on a college campus. And at the time, they were developing a Pan-Africanist orientation and ideology. It was a time during which, as we began to reflect on our heritage and realize that the names we had were the names that had been imposed on us by slave masters, that my extensive English Christian names and English surnames were a reflection of the fact that we were in captivity and we were slaves. It was a time during which a lot of black activists were changing their names to more accurately reflect their heritage. And that is how Kojo Nnamdi was born. Kojo means born on Monday, which I was born on in the Ghanaian language of Ga, and Nnamdi I took because I was a great admirer of Nnamdi Azikiwe, who was Nigeria's first independence leader. And so I took it as a surname, even though he had it as a Christian name.
You also spent some time in Montreal, and the Black Power movement here in the United States in particular attracted you. What specifically, because there was some time in New York there, what specifically about the Black Power movement was attractive to you in New York and then later here in Washington, D.C.?
The attraction for me really started in Montreal, Canada, where I arrived in 1967, at a time when the civil rights movement in this country had, for a brief period of time, been dominated by figures in the Black Power movement. And when I got to Montreal, Canada, my roommates who had been at McGill University prior to my time there had been studying and reading a lot about the Black Power movement. It appealed to us because, in part, of our youth, and because as young people we tended to be more rebellious than our older contemporaries were. And so there was that kind of natural spirit of youthful rebellion to which the Black Power movement appealed. But then it also appealed to us on the basis of its ideological premise, and that is, it called for power to black people in communities in which we existed in large number. It didn't simply seek equality, which is what the civil rights movement was all about. It sought to take it a step farther into empowering black people, especially in our own communities. There was a book that was co-written by Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton, that was called Black Power, that we devoured and read. And so it had a certain appeal for us also because, being young and rebellious, we were more interested in confronting oppression openly. And the Black Power movement seemed to be doing that. It was interesting because SNCC had come out of people who were working in the South, but the Black Power movement tended to be more attractive as an urban phenomenon. I was born in the city of Georgetown, Guyana. I have never lived in a rural community in my life. I was a city person We were in the city of Montreal, and so it was very attractive. After spending a little more than a year at McGill University in Montreal, Canada, I moved to New York City in the summer of 1968. And when I was working in New York City, one of the people I was working with in a firm on Wall Street happened to be a member of the Black Panther Party. He was a member of a chapter that was at Borough of Manhattan College, and because at the time the Black Panther Party were among the more prominent exponents of Black Power, I briefly joined the Black Panther Party when I was in New York in 1968, and that was the continuing appeal that Black Power had for me.
You're known for your time in journalism. How did you brought with you to Washington, D.C. and to your career of journalism the experiences of being in the Black Panthers, the experiences of working in and around SNCC? How did that inform your work in journalism?
When I came to Washington, D.C. to affiliate with the Center for Black Education, that organization had been founded by veterans of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. I had never, before that time, interacted with SNCC veterans. I had interacted with people in the Black Panther Party, but never before with SNCC veterans. When I came into that organization, and it was set up along the lines of a college, so to speak, I began to take classes from some of those people, and they would, in addition to what was being taught in our classes, share quite a few of their experiences in SNCC. And those people were my mentors when I came to Washington. People like Cortland Cox, Charlie Cobb, Jimmy Garrett, Marvin Holloway, Bellevue Rooks, Gene Wiley, Judy Richardson, Ralph Featherstone. These were all SNCC veterans who, in literal terms, schooled me when I first came here. But at the same time as learning from their experiences in SNCC, I was a part of an organization that had put together a bookstore, Drum and Spear Bookstore, had put together a press, Drum and Spear Press, was in the process of trying to refine an ideological posture of Pan-Africanism. But their experiences, and these people were just slightly older than I was, their experiences informed me a great deal about what I wanted to do. The other thing that I brought to Washington and the Center for Black Education was a keen interest in acting. I had started acting in high school when I was in Guyana, and after high school became a part of a vibrant amateur theater there. So when I came to the center, in addition to its classes, the center had several groups, and one of them was a drama group. I became the coordinator of that drama group and the director of most of its productions. During those years, the business of radio, commercial radio in the United States, had a requirement for a certain portion of public affairs programming in order to maintain their licenses. Radio stations in those days were forced to conduct surveys of their communities, find out what people in those communities were interested in, and organize public affairs programming around those issues. WOL AM radio, now owned by Radio One and Kathy Hughes and Alfred Liggins, was in those days owned by the Sonderling Corporation, a nationwide corporation. And in order to fulfill their public affairs requirement, they needed community organizations that would be willing to provide content, programming, essentially for free, because these commercial radio stations were not interested in paying people for public affairs programming, which was invariably buried on the weekend, and often on the weekend at night, in which they didn't expect a great many people to be listening. Long story short, our drama group was producing children's plays that were written by Jennifer Lawson, another SNCC veteran, and Mimi Hayes, called Saya Watoto, The Hour of the Children. After our drama groups had been performing those plays on a weekly basis on WOL for a while, they said, well, is there anything else that you can do? And we came up with the idea of doing a weekly news magazine. Since many of us were actors, we felt we could act like news people. The organization was putting out a weekly newspaper called the Pan-African, or the Pan-Africanist, the Pan-African I think it was called, every week. So we were interested and involved in gathering news also. And so putting together a weekly news broadcast was something we felt we could do fairly well. And we did that. It was called Sauti, The Voice, on WOL Radio, again on Sunday nights for a year or two. I was working at Drum and Spear Bookstore, and then Drum and Spear Bookstore in the early 1970s closed. But before it closed, a radio station named WHUR, Howard University Radio, came on the air in 1971, and that was the radio that we played 24/7 in the bookstore. So I had a lot of experience listening to WHUR radio. And so after Drum and Spear Bookstore closed and I found myself out of a job, I was a young parent, I had twin children, I needed a job, and WHUR advertised for a news editor. I applied for that position, got it, and that's why I sit before you today with a career in journalism.
To work on a show called The Voice, to work for a station that's embedded on a black college, gave you a lot of space to stay in your Pan-Africanist tradition that you seem to be in your young age. Are you grateful for that, and do you think that helped direct how you practice journalism then and even today?
Yes, because when I went to WHUR, I was, as you pointed out, still in my Pan-Africanist mode, even though my Pan-Africanist colleagues, many of them in the African Liberation Support Committee, which put on the first African Liberation Day in 1972, a lot of them, us, were moving left at the time towards Marxism, towards scientific socialism. There was an element of socialism in Pan-Africanism anyway, and one of its greatest progenitors, Kwame Nkrumah, was himself a Marxist. So that's the direction in which we were moving. And Howard University Radio at the time in those days had a format that was not unlike Pacifica stations today. A combination of news, music, and information that seemed to drop out of the sky at any time, that it was not particularly programmed in such a way that you got the same programming every day. So it gave those of us who were interested in a way, experimenting with radio, the opportunity to do so, something that's very difficult to find today. However, once we were involved in news, we had to be involved in seeking truth and in seeking to have that truth accepted as credible. So at some point, we had to leave our ideological orientation at the door, but we could have it reflected in how much of the world we covered. And since we were Pan-Africanist, moving towards leftist, we made sure that the Daily Drum, the newscast on WHUR, covered the world of black people. And in that world, we found every country on the planet Earth, but we had a great deal of focus on Africa, a lot of focus on the Caribbean, a lot of focus on places where black people lived, both in the United States and abroad. And as we progressed, we said, you know, it's one thing to be doing a newscast this thorough. In fact, the Daily Drum, eventually 1 hour of it, was really based on the National Public Radio format of All Things Considered, which existed in those days. We consciously fashioned it in that kind of way, with more of an emphasis on black people around the world. And at some point we said, look, we have a good product here. How do we get more people to listen to this product? Because in the final analysis, you are only as effective as the number of people who are listening to you. And at that point, the former news director, Robert Taylor, had become the general manager of the station. And we had our own little left to sell, kind of in the station, in which we decided that the only way we could have credibility for what we felt was a really good news and information presentation was by attracting more listeners to the station generally. And so that's when we abandoned the kind of Pacifica-like format of the station and decided to go for more popular music. That's when we decided to pump the funk, okay? And when we made that decision, not only did we do that in the daytime, but by then, Melvin Lindsay, the original host of The Quiet Storm, who started out as a student intern at WHUR when he started that format, was doing that show from 7 to midnight, and it was already rising to the #1 position in this market, and the Daily Drum came on just before The Quiet Storm. So once we were able to make sure that the daytime parts of the programming was attracting attention, we knew the audience would rise as it got to 7 o'clock in the evening. And so we wanted to create an environment in which a credible newscast was being heard by a large number of people. And I'll never forget, there was a columnist for the Washington Post, an African American named William Raspberry, who wrote a column in the Washington Post sometime in the early 1980s maybe, or late 1970s, saying, "The Daily Drum has arrived as a serious newscast to be listened to in Washington." And we felt at that point we had achieved our objective. And I'll say this, because we felt that given our socialist orientation, that the only way that socialist views could be acceptable in a capitalist environment is if the socialists were not failures. Because a lot of people feel that people turn to socialism because they can't succeed in capitalist society. If we could run a for-profit radio station and make it #1 in this market in a for-profit environment, then our socialist beliefs would have greater credibility. That was the view we had at that point.
At that point, you mentioned William Raspberry was powerful and impactful to so many here in the area, particularly being a black columnist at the Washington Post. There was a groundswell of black journalists everywhere who wanted to find kinship, who wanted to find organization and community, and thus birthed the National Association of Black Journalists. Given your orientations, given your experiences with SNCC, with the Center for Black Education, with the Black Panther Party, with your Pan-Africanist time at Drum and Spear, how did you view the founding of the NABJ, and then how did you find yourself interacting and engaging with that organization?
Back sometime in the 1970s, before the NABJ was formally formed, there was a conference in Houston, Texas, to deliberate on the forming of the NABJ. And WHUR sent me to attend that conference. That conference represented the planning stages of what would later become the NABJ. For some reason or the other, the next year, I think it was, when the NABJ was actually founded, I was not a part of it. I don't remember at the time what I was doing, but when I looked at my contemporaries who were the founding members of NABJ, these were people with whom I was working very closely at that time, and can't remember why I was not a part of that process. But once there became a Washington Association of Black Journalists, I joined the WABJ and have, from time to time, gone to the NABJ conferences over the years and participated in the organization. I thought then and continue to think that it is a crucially important organization, the National Association of Black Journalists, and continue to support it.
That organization led the way as far as journalists are concerned in beating the drum for the anti-apartheid movement and also for the general liberation of a great number of African nations. As a journalist, how did you see your role in that movement, and what were some of your experiences? What were some things you remember from that time?
I became a journalist as a Pan-Africanist. So there was always a great deal of focus in the Daily Drum in general and in my journalistic life in particular on Africa. The Daily Drum every day included a segment called the Africa Roundup, in which one of our correspondents, I remember his name, Mohammed Samora, who was from Sierra Leone, did the Africa Roundup. When we first started participating in Pan-Africanist venues and in Pan-Africanist events, the May 23rd, 1972 African Liberation Day demonstration was particularly focused on the liberation of those portions of the continent which were still under colonial rule or which were still under apartheid. So for me, covering demonstrations that had to do with the liberation of those territories was particularly important. But when an organization called the Southern Africa Support Project, back in those days, one of the leaders of which is a professor here at the University of the District of Columbia, Sylvia Hill, when they started leading demonstrations at the South African Embassy here in Washington to protest the apartheid state and to protest the continued incarceration of Nelson Mandela. When Randall Robinson and Trans-Africa came along and increased the focus on the liberation movements in general and on South Africa in particular, as a reporter, being able to cover those demonstrations, because a lot of the people I was covering in those demonstrations were people who had been colleagues of mine in the movement before. Covering those demonstrations and being able to be in media to watch Mozambique get its independence, to watch Angola get its independence, to watch what was then called Southwest Africa get its independence, to watch Rhodesia become Zimbabwe and get its independence, and then finally to watch the end of apartheid in South Africa, to watch the release of Nelson Mandela from jail, and to be working at Howard University Television hosting a show called Evening Exchange when Nelson Mandela visited that campus. Those were the fulfillment of my dreams as an activist and as a journalist. There was nothing that I can think of that was more important to me during that time.
You mentioned Angola. How much joy did it give you as a leftist to know that Cuba at the time was instrumental in helping Angola get the liberation that they so desperately sought and deserved?
It was huge. It was huge because during the time when Cuba was providing that assistance to Angola, Fidel Castro declared Cuba not a Latin American country, but a Latin African country. And for those of us who had been arguing for years that if you looked at the population of Cuba and saw how many black people there were there, that Castro should recognize the fundamental relationship between Cuba and the African continent and go beyond that realization to providing support, military support for the liberation movement. I do have to say that at the time in my own country in which I was born, Guyana, South America, the government of that country at that time also provided significant support for the liberation movements in Southern Africa and provided money for those. Those times represented for me a period during which the consciousness of black people in general, but black activists in particular, around the world were heightened because what our forebears like Kwame Nkrumah and CLR James saw long before we came along were the links that connected us in our enslavement, the links that connected us in our oppression, were the links that were necessary for our ultimate freedom. And seeing that come into fruition was very important to me as a journalist at that time. In many ways, the realization of a dream come true.
It's one thing to see it abroad. It's another thing to see it in your own city. And you were a journalist, a prominent one, at WHUR and with WHUT, as one Marion Barry became mayor of Washington, D.C., and the city as a whole grew more autonomous with more black people, thus more black power. Tell the viewers about what it was like to experience that, and obviously your memories with the late Marion Barry.
My memories with Marion Barry go back to the first time I stepped on a college campus as a student, after leaving McGill University in Montreal, Canada, was when I was at the Center for Black Education, founded by many of Marion Barry's colleagues from SNCC. Marion Barry was then running a program in Washington along with his then wife, Mary Treadwell, called Pride Incorporated. Pride Incorporated, which served particularly impoverished youth in Washington, D.C., had a program that it had developed with American University called the Pride AU program, in which one could get to take classes at American University through Pride Incorporated. I took a class for 10 credits in photography through the Pride AU program. How did I get into that program? Because Cortland Cox at the Center for Black Education placed a call to his friend Marion Barry at Pride Incorporated and said, this young guy needs to get into this program. That's how I got into that program. Shortly thereafter, when I was working at Drum & Spear bookstore, Marion Barry made his first run for office for the school board in the District of Columbia and became president of the school board. Drum & Spear bookstore decided that school board meetings would be a good place for us to have book displays and sell books. So I'd be the one who had to go to these school board meetings, set up our book displays, and while members of the community were fighting with members of the school board in the auditorium, I'd be at the entrance of the auditorium trying to sell books. And Cortland Cox would tell me to remind the president of the school board, Marion Barry, to tell the audience that Drum & Spear bookstore was outside selling books. Marion would not remember until near the end of the proceedings. I would run up to the stage and tug his slacks or near his shoes because he was on stage. He'd say, oh yeah. By the way, Drum & Spear bookstore is selling books outside. But that was the beginning of, for him, a career in politics in which he became known ultimately as mayor for life of the District of Columbia. But what was most important about that career is what another of his colleagues from SNCC, Frank Smith, called the Marion Barry Revolution. Before Marion Barry became mayor of Washington, all of the top positions in the city, all of the major contracts that were city funded went to white people. Black contractors were shut out, and blacks were shut out of a lot of the higher level positions in DC government. One must say, however, that Walter Washington, who preceded Marion Barry, tended to change that somewhat, but not at the level of, to put it bluntly, where the money was. And the money, frankly, was in who could do business with the District of Columbia, who could get contracts with the District of Columbia, and who could get upper level positions, not just in the mayor's cabinet, but across the board in the District of Columbia. That was what the Marion Barry Revolution changed. It brought black people into all levels of district government and all levels of district contracting, created in very many ways the expansion of the black middle class in this region. There are those who argue with some degree of credibility that Marion Barry created Prince George's County, being the most affluent, predominantly African American county in the United States. That's the impact that Marion Barry had on this city. Obviously, he had problems. Obviously, he had his flaws, but that impact is what he will be remembered for. That was the Marion Barry Revolution.
Compare your joy or your pride or whatever feeling that may have been seeing the Marion Barry Black Revolution in Washington, D.C. with observing the liberation of the African nations. Compare and contrast those feelings.
Never been asked that before, but it's fascinating to compare it, because as Marion Barry was rising in Washington, D.C., you had the great revolutionary leaders in Africa rising at the same time. Now, interestingly enough, some of those revolutionary leaders, like Marion Barry, would ultimately disappoint in some respects. But we're talking about the days when they were rising. We're talking about 1980, when Zimbabwe would get its independence. We're talking about what used to be known as Southwest Africa, now known as Namibia, when it was getting its independence under Sam Nujoma. We're talking about watching Angola under its leadership, talking about watching Mozambique under its leadership, watching for the first time black people come to power in those places. And one has to remember that it wasn't until the 1960s that governments in the Caribbean got their independence. So you're also watching those governments come to power in those places. And you're beginning to see expressions of black power around the world that represents what people have been fighting for generations. And you have the ability to report on those things. We sent Charlie Cobb, when he became a reporter at HOR, we sent him to Angola to witness this. He went to South Africa. We were able to put reporters in those places to report on these things firsthand. When we saw a revolution in the English-speaking Caribbean for the first time in Grenada, we were able to have reporters report on what was going on there. A certain, albeit different kind of empowering of the people taking place in those places. Those were very heady days to be a reporter.
We mentioned briefly that you spent some time at WHUT and the television station, and depending upon how old you are and what medium you may choose in Washington, D.C., folks may know you best either from the Daily Drum or from the Evening Exchange. But television is a little bit of a different medium. How did you come to that medium, and how did you seek to do the same work you had done at HUR, yet through this different beast of a medium?
At HUR in 1984 really, I created an interview program that still airs on HUR to this day, just before 7 o'clock in the evening, called Insight. The Daily Drum was 1 hour long. I created Insight to occupy the last 20 minutes of the Daily Drum. And for that program, as host, I would interview various notables who either happened to be in Washington at the time or who happened to live in Washington. Prior to that, most of my journalistic work had been straight reporting. Doing Insight introduced me to the art skill, if you will, of, I call it listening more. Because for me, interviewing has a lot to do with listening. When I was a straight reporter, I covered a press conference. I had it all on tape because we invariably recorded it for radio. I could go back and listen to it if I happened not to be paying attention during the press conference. I could go back and listen to it. Doing a live interview on the air every day, there was no tape to listen to. You had to listen to what you were being told. At that time, Evening Exchange, which had been created at Howard University Television, then WHMM TV, was being hosted by Bernie McCain, who was himself a legendary broadcast interviewer here in Washington. However, at the time, Bernie was doing two jobs. On a nightly basis, he was hosting Evening Exchange from 7:30 to 8:30 p.m. at Howard. And on a daily basis, he was doing a radio talk show in Philadelphia from like 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. So every single day, Bernie would drive from Philadelphia to Washington to host Evening Exchange. He would often arrive a little late. And you know television, when you're late, the show can't be done. They had to put up a tape. Sometimes he would arrive tired because he'd been working, and sometimes he would not show up at all. If he was unavoidably thrown off track by a traffic jam or something on the way there. But he was a great interview, and so WHMM did what it could to keep Bernie McCain as host. But after a while, it became apparent that he couldn't do this. I seem to remember he was doing a third job someplace else at the time also. He couldn't do it. And so they tried out a couple of people from WHUR, and they didn't work out. And finally, the producer, Colleen Pianki of Evening Exchange, came to me and said, would you mind trying this on for a while? That was in April of 1985. I was doing Insight from 6:40 to 7 p.m. and then dashing over to do Evening Exchange from 7:30 to 8:30. After doing it during the months of April and May, when the show shut down for the summer, it didn't resume until September, Colleen Pianki and the then manager of WHMM, Arnold Wallace, offered me the job on a full-time basis. I said, well, that's going to be difficult on a full-time basis to do both of these jobs, so I'm probably going to have to quit the job at WHUR. So that's what I did, and they moved Evening Exchange from 7:30 to 7 p.m., and that's what I did from September of 1985 until November of 2011. I did it for 26 years.
You talked about the art of listening. Education, in many senses, is a function and practice of listening. Did any of your time and experience at the Center for Black Education help provide the skill set you would need to be a good listener, thus to be a good host?
I did nothing but listen when I was at the center. With the exception of the role I played in the drama group, I was not a leader. I was a listener. And the Center for Black Education was classes, and there were, for the few years that it existed, so adamant about classes and adamant about rebelling against the system that we had classes on Christmas Day. I remember my sister was visiting me from the Caribbean for Christmas that year. I guess it was 1970. And on Christmas Day, Christmas morning, I got up and said, I got to go to class. And so she came with me to class on Christmas Day. Suffice it to say that the class was not very well attended, because a lot of people couldn't tell their parents they were not coming home for Christmas. But the experiences of the people who were teaching those classes, the depth of knowledge of the people who were teaching those classes about Africa, classes about political science, we did math, we did bricklaying, you attended those classes and you listened and you got a really rounded understanding of where you fit into the world. Because the center was based on the premise that you couldn't just teach the social sciences to black students, you had to teach math and science and give them a rounded view of the world. We even started a children's educational center where we were teaching children. But what I was doing in those days was listening. And yes, listening is a skill. And we were in an environment in which it's much worse today. We are inundated with so many signals coming at us from different places that taking the time out to listen. The other reason I developed listening skills was because when I was growing up in Guyana, South America, there was no television. And so radio was our only broadcast source of information and our only broadcast source of entertainment. So I grew up in an environment where when we came home from school for lunch and said to my mom, here's what happened in school this morning, she would say, shh, I am listening to my stories on the radio. You'll have to speak to me. And so she listened to the radio. It was never background for what you were doing. It was something that you actively listened to.
The center taught you so much about the world around you. We sometimes only converse about the role that women and sisters play when there's a woman who's the subject. But I'm curious, from your purview as a man, what role did women play? How did gender manifest itself, if at all, in your Pan-Africanist experiences, in your experiences around NABJ, in your experiences in journalism, and in your experiences with the Center for Black Education?
After I got to the center, I was surprised to discover that in the civil rights movement writ large, and in SNCC in particular, women had to struggle for recognition. Because at the Center for Black Education, from the moment that I arrived there were women in the leadership group of the center and women in the leadership of conducting classes. I mentioned names like Jean Wiley, Belvie Rooks, Judy Richardson, Daphne Muse. These people were all mentors of mine. And so I did not realize that they had emerged from an environment in which they had to struggle for that kind of recognition, an environment in which they were routinely considered as secretaries or people who washed dishes or people who prepared the meals for the guys who were going to be leading the organization. The center adopted that principle without ever having mentioned it. I walked into that environment, found that environment comfortable for me. The people who were writing our children's plays were Jennifer Lawson and Mimi Hayes. We had to go to them for instruction on how to perform in those plays. It was never a problem. And so this was a time in the 1970s at which the so-called women's liberation movement and feminism was gaining prominence, in which we felt at the time that women were entirely our equals, responsibilities had to be shared. It even, by the time we got married, went into our marriages, that all responsibilities for cooking and cleaning and everything else had to be shared. And it did create some havoc in some of the organizations at the time, because a lot of guys weren't willing to accept that. But it was something that, luckily for me, I encountered the moment I entered the activist movement.
It's one thing to be in and of the activist movement in black spaces, WHUR, WHUT, anything that starts with a WHU. It's another thing to be of that ilk, of that training, and be somewhere that starts with WAM. Your career has taken you beyond the walls and campus of just Howard University, and also to American University. And in fact, for many, you were well regarded there and perhaps even best known for your time at WAMU. How did you bring with you your experiences and your trainings and your leanings of Pan-Africanism, leftist socialism, and all that we've discussed thus far into spaces that aren't always as welcoming to that?
As my career at Howard University Television lengthened, and I had learned a long time before to leave my ideological orientation at the door when it comes to the covering of news and the covering of issues, my commitment to socialism and to Pan-Africanism frankly took a back seat to what I felt was most important. And that is, if ideas having to do with Pan-Africanism and socialism are important, then if they are allowed to compete fairly in the arena, in the battle of ideas, then their truth and their validity will emerge. It is no longer necessary for me to expound and espouse those beliefs, but just to make sure that there are spaces where people who hold those beliefs, public spaces where they can participate in the engagement and battle of ideas. We were able to provide those spaces at HUR and on Evening Exchange at Howard University Television. We were able to provide those spaces also. It was just as important to me that white people be included in those spaces, because by that time I knew white people of the left and right whose ideas I felt were important, so that on a regular basis on Evening Exchange, you would see Askia Muhammad, who was affiliated with the Nation of Islam and Muhammad Speaks newspaper. You would see Mark Plotkin, who is Jewish and liberal. You would see Tony Snow, who was a conservative, working then for the Washington Times, all sitting on the same panel having a conversation. So to the extent to which black people were excluded from conversations, it was important to me to make sure that all people and women, Bonnie Orbey was a regular guest, several, to make sure that everybody was included on Howard University Television in those conversations. And so when, I guess it was in 1998, I was approached by American University to host what used to be known as the Derek McGinty Show, that had become a show called Public Interest. When I was approached to do that show, I didn't think much of it, because I thought that I'd be doing much of the same thing that I was doing on Evening Exchange. What was, however, most important about it was that I was doing a show called Evening Exchange in a predominantly black section of the city for a historically black university. And I was invited to do a show west of Rock Creek Park in a predominantly white section of the city in a predominantly, at a station owned by a predominantly white university. And I saw it as an opportunity to bring those two communities together in a Washington that has historically been divided along racial and class lines, that my presence in these two institutions and any role I could play in having them collaborate would be able to help people in this town understand what our differences were, but what we also shared in common. And I thought at the time, and still do, that it was a very ambitious enterprise in which to engage, but I really wanted to engage in it. Now, that was my thinking about it. The reality of it, I guess I can best tell you in terms of what happens, or what happened when I would walk down the street. Mark Plotkin and I, when I first started at WMU, would be walking down the street, and all of the black people on the street would say, "Hey, Kojo, what's up?" And none of the white people on the street would recognize me, even though Howard University Television did have a significant white audience. None of the white. He said, "Why is it everywhere we go, all of these black people recognize you?" I said, "Because there's only one television station in Washington that thinking black people watch, and that's Howard University Television." In those days, BET was still just doing videos at the time. So a whole lot of black people who were interested in ideas weren't watching BET, but they were watching HUT, when a whole lot of white people in the city didn't even know we existed. So then, after I had been at AMU for a while, I'd walk into places and white people would look at me and not recognize me, but the minute I opened my mouth, they would turn around and say, "Oh, you're Kojo Nnamdi. I know that voice." So I now live an existence where black people recognize me by sight and white people recognize me by voice. If that's bringing people together, then maybe I've served some purpose in that regard.
When we think about the Black Power movement, we think about young people. We think about agitation. You started the interview earlier talking about the in-your-face rebellion to white supremacy. We don't often think about how those folks age and how their politics and their ideas, which is a word you've come back to a number of times, age. Describe your ideas aging. Describe your politics aging. Describe how you have aged.
When I look at the Black Lives Matter activist, I see me when I was younger. That was the level of my engagement. I wanted to be out there and confront racism wherever I saw it, and I wanted to do it on the street. I wanted to be seen doing it. I wanted to be seen standing up to it. I wanted to be militant because I felt that militancy would be more effective than a demeanor in which I was seeking respectability. As I have grown older, I think I have refined my points of view. I think to some extent I have mellowed, as people do when they get older. I still feel very strongly about justice and about fighting injustice, but I no longer consider myself a Marxist-Leninist. I think the fall of socialism in Eastern Europe in the 1980s taught me a great deal about how the ideas of scientific socialism and democratic centralism could be used very, very easily and manipulatively in an authoritative manner to create what in fact became dictatorships. So I began to pull away from those ideas, recognize the fault in them, and even begin to recognize the faults in the movement in which I myself participated, in the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, began to recognize some of the tendencies of males in these organizations to want to occupy positions of leadership, to essentially not acknowledge the contributions that women were making, the extent to which I might have been a part of that at some point, I began to recognize. And so I think as I've gotten older, for me, truth has become more important than ever. What we in journalism call objectivity, which is something I frankly don't believe in, but making sure that facts do matter have become of crucial importance to me. Making sure that I am not following blindly any ideas or any leaders, that my eyes are always open to the flaws in the ideas of the people with whom I'm associated, and most importantly, to the possible flaws in my own ideas. I always like to tell people that you shouldn't take yourself too seriously, because you should realize that you can be wrong. If you think that because you have fastened onto an idea that you have an obligation to cling to that idea, even when there are others who are pointing flaws in that idea, then you need to check yourself out, because you should always be open to change and always be open to new ideas. We live in a society in which technology is changing society very rapidly. I have friends who refuse to use email. I have friends but you have to try to understand what is going on around you and either acknowledge it if there is no injustice involved, or fight against it if there is injustice involved, but not to fight against it simply because it's something that you're not used to. We have to learn how to accommodate new ideas, and when I look, as I said at the beginning, at the Black Lives Matter activists, I saw me, I saw all of the things I did right, I also see some of the mistakes that I made at the time, and I say, okay, you have to learn from your mistakes, but here I am. If you want to know the mistakes we made, I can tell you about them.
I was just going to ask that. What is the role of the elders who have gone through this in the space of advising or in their relationship with the younger people who are in the streets confronting brutality and injustice these days?
To try to have them avoid some of the mistakes we make, even as we allow them to chart their own courses in life. You know, we and the Black Panther Party thought it was cool to refer to cops as pigs. And then we suffered the retaliation of the police because they were who was really armed. We may have had a few pistols, etc., and we actually thought at one time that we could carry out urban guerrilla warfare and that we could take over these cities and run them. We discovered that that was not true. We discovered that taunting people who are more heavily armed than we are can result in us bearing the brunt of their revenge, so that when we started calling the cops pigs and the cops began to retaliate, you saw what they did to the members of the Black Panther Party, the way in which members of the Black Panther Party were killed. We, after a while, learned to be slightly more judicious in how we responded to these individuals, because when you are young, you have the feeling that you are invincible, you feel empowered, and then you get cut down. And if you are cut down in a very vicious and violent manner, it can break your spirit. So what's very important to me with young people in like the Black Lives Matter movement is to not have their spirits broken by pushing themselves too hard, too soon, but at the same time, allowing them to lead themselves. We cannot lead them, we can advise them.
We can never write our own obituaries. The tale of Kojo Nnamdi will be left to someone many years, we pray, down the road to write. But if you had a little hand in saying what should go in that obituary, how should the legacy of Rex Orville Montague Paul, later Kojo Nnamdi, be remembered?
I'm glad you brought up the name Rex Orville Montague Paul, because I see legacies as a part of a continuum. And it started with my parents. For me, I never knew my grandparents, but for me, it started with my parents. I grew up in a home in which my father and mother and their friends were intimately involved in debating what was going on all over the world. I remember my parents and their friends talking about the overthrow of a leader named Mossadegh in Iran. I remember sitting in the living room and hearing that conversation, that the United States and the CIA had overthrown somebody named Mossadegh and put somebody named the Shah of Iran in power. It was only in later years that I realized that happened in 1954. At the time I was 9 years old, and listening to my parents and their friends discussing what was going on all over the world. I remember in 1957, waking up in the morning, looking out my front window and seeing lots of black people in African garb going past my house and asking my parents, I was 12 years old, why are those people dressed like that? Where are they going? They said, today is the day that Ghana gets its independence. And we here in the Western world, in the Caribbean, are celebrating Ghana getting its independence. I didn't quite understand what they meant, but that was Rex Orville Montague Paul in that environment coming to consciousness. I remember when I was 15 years old in high school, having read a great deal of history in an elite high school about the history of Europe and Great Britain. The first history teacher who taught me about Toussaint Louverture in Haiti, for the first time in history, I saw myself reflected in somebody who had a role in changing the world and in ending slavery. That was Rex Orville Montague Paul. When I came to Canada and the United States, I came as somebody who had been produced by an anti-colonial movement, of which my parents and their friends were a part. So there was already a degree of consciousness that had been instilled in me against oppression by witnessing the fight against colonialism. Guyana got its independence the year before I came abroad, and I was a part of that. So in very many ways, I was ready for the Black Power movement and everything that happened since then. And so as I evolved into being a journalist, and I evolved into being a talk show host, and I evolved into whatever I am today, I still carry those sentiments. I carry a tattoo on my arm that has the District of Columbia flag on it, if you can see that, because I want justice for the District of Columbia, which is allowed no vote in the Congress of the United States. In at least one respect, I do not maintain a certain neutrality, and that is on that issue. That is who I am today. I would like to believe that over the span of my life, that my primary interest has been in providing or assisting to provide justice for people who are oppressed and people who are discriminated against, wherever those people happen to be. If I have performed one small service in life, I would like that to be my legacy.
His name is Kojo Nnamdi. He has been our guest here on the DC Black Power Chronicles. Thank you for joining us. I'm Ray Baker. Until next time.